All right, let's get started. For those of you who have um, not been on one of these webinars before, my name is Eric. I work at a company called Academy XI, which I'll kind of explain a little bit about what we do shortly. First, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're virtually gathered and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Again, Eric from Academy XI here. Today's webinar is all about service design and unpacking, what it is, what it's all about. First, I'll kind of talk a little bit about Academy XI and why we are in a position to talk about service design and why it's of interest to us. And then we can sort of talk a little bit more about what we're going to be doing today. So Academy XI is a school, an Australian school, despite my accent. I'm based here in Sydney, Australia. And we teach design and digital disciplines is the easiest way to describe it. So, emerging type of roles, very career-focused roles, where there's going to be more jobs available next year in these roles than there are right now, and more the year after that as well. So we have two campuses, which are very much closed at the moment due to COVID. But also a whole suite of online courses. We teach things like user experience design, service design is a big one, obviously, which is the tie-in to today. CX is an up-and-coming subject for us as well. UI, those are kind of all on the design side, graphic design too. And then over on the digital side of things, product management, data analytics, digital marketing, agile. We teach VR and AR as well. So it's, in terms of the training that we do for individuals, it's very much about take a course, get a job in this space. You're off and running into your career, hopefully for life. My role is head of partnerships, which is a title that people have when it could basically mean anything. What it really means is that I run corporate training programs. So I'm in with heads of learning and heads of like service design, UX, inside corporates and government organizations, developing training programs for their teams. So either upskilling in things like service design, UX in specific areas, or increasingly as kind of the wider world of corporates kind of hears more about service design, UX, the design space in general, starts to become more interested in it as design gains more and more traction inside corporates, which is a great thing that is happening right now. More other departments are trying to pull some of the tools out of design and the service design space and use them in their own worlds, which is great to see and is something that we facilitate, and we're obviously big fans of that happening. So that's my kind of world. Coming back to service design, it is something that I've said before on some of these webinars, so some of you will be familiar with it, but for a lot of people, service design is a bit of a black box. People outside of it don't really know what service designers do per se. I think sometimes even other designers might not even really quite know what service designers do. It's only about an 8 or 10-year-old discipline as a title. I will still see in job postings, like, job postings for must have 10 years of experience as a service designer. And yeah, good luck finding a whole range of people with that much experience, because it barely exists. So in that note, or sort of in that spirit, we thought today we could sort of lift the lid on service design and talk to some practitioners who are living and breathing it every day, find out, what it is to them, what a day in the life of a service designer looks like, what excites them about the job, and some of the challenges they face and the problems that they're able to solve for clients. So we're shortly going to shift over to them. Just before I go, just mention at the bottom of the screen, if you've been in Zoom sessions before, you'll be familiar with the chat function and the Q&A. In the chat, feel free to shout out your name and where you're from and your job. If you just want to make sure to respond to all panelists and attendees, otherwise it just goes to us, the panelists, just so everyone can see. We can get a bit of a friendly vibe going. And then concurrently in the Q&A, if you have any questions for our panelists or for myself, feel free to fire those in during the session. And then we're going to leave, well, I always say this, we'll attempt to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So pretty much any question you want to ask, And then what we try to do is any questions that we don't get to, we will respond to in the follow-up email that we send tomorrow. We'll also usually send a recording of this for anyone who didn't catch the whole thing. And then we've got a few kind of freebies and upcoming webinar information pieces in that email as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce Harriet and Cassia, both from Make Studios. There they are. So I'll pass over to you guys now, and they will talk about the world of service design and their place within it.
Thanks so much, Eric. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me 2 seconds. Is it all good on your end, Eric? Can you see that?
Yep.
Great. Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. I'm Kasia, and I'm a service design lead at Make Studios.
And hi, I'm Harriet. I'm also a service designer and the associate director at Make Studios. For those of you who haven't heard of us before, we are a strategic and service design agency based here in Melbourne and also with a sister company in Hong Kong.
So today we wanted to chat to you about what service design is, as Eric mentioned, why it's important, and what is it that service designers do, and with a little bit of sprinkling of how we do it at Make. And again, as Eric mentioned, there is this Q&A, so shoot through your questions and hopefully we can get through as many as we can at the end. So what is service design? We didn't think that it was necessary for us to create another brilliant definition. So instead, we have selected some great definitions from the world that we'd like to share with you and discuss the different nuances of each of them. So this first one by Stefan Moritz says that service design helps innovate, so create new, or improve existing services to make them more useful, usable, desirable for clients, and efficient as well as effective for organizations. There are two interesting things in this definition that I wanted to point out. So first is about how service design is about creating value for clients or customers, and about how that value is created. We use human-centered design and methodology in service design. Some of you might have come to the webinar about human-centered design at Academy XI before. So when we think about human-centered design in service design, it's about both the humans using the service and the humans creating the service. Another interesting thing about this definition is that service design can be both about looking at understanding current state and how can that be improved, and about imagining new possibilities. And we refer to that as creating ideal state in service design. The other definition we wanted to share with you is by Birgit Mager. I might be saying her name wrong. I'm really sorry if I'm doing that. And
it's probably not on here, so it's okay.
And she said that service design choreographs processes, technologies, and interactions within complex systems in order to co-create value for relevant stakeholders. So what's interesting about this definition here is that service design is also about considering the system within which the organization and its clients exist. And as service designers, we should really be looking at how the organization is creating value beyond the immediate value for the clients. So for example, a really important debate happening for the past few years is looking at how organizations are creating or not necessarily creating value for the planet through their actions. And the last definition that we wanted to talk about is by Simon Clatworthy. And he said that service design is designed for experiences that happen over time across different touch points. So what's interesting here is that service design is looking at how that system can change over time and how the different stakeholders within it are interacting with each other. And so this is what he means by touch points. So if I was to recap, what the kind of gist of these three definitions is that service design is about designing the experience of both the clients and the service providers. It's about the larger system within which the service exists, how the different stakeholders interact with each other in it, and how it might change over time.
Awesome. So we kind of understand what the definition of service design is, but why is it important? And I think this is quite self-evident if you've ever been the person to phone up the contact center, been passed around to about 5 or 6 different people, and none of them have remembered your name or what your issue is that you're trying to get solved. Equally, if you've ever had to create your own workarounds in an experience. So the one that always gets me is having to create a brand new hyper complex password every 6 months for something. I think this happens in Teams sometimes. And so, you know, the idea is that it's supposed to increase security, but because it's me and I'm always going to forget my passwords, I have a tendency to do kind of a bit of a hack and put them in my notes, or even less responsible than that, stick them on a post-it note on my laptop. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done it. And then equally, it might be that you've noticed a process or a system in your own workplace that just kind of seems unnecessarily complicated, and it's kind of become that way over time, and you just really want to fix it. So these are the kind of problems that we might be looking to overcome using service design. And here are a few other reasons as well that service design can be really helpful. So first up, just kind of by their nature, a lot of organizations tend to be divided into silos. So this means that different parts of the organization don't necessarily talk to one another that much, even if they're sort of different parts of delivering the same service. Or they can end up relying on legacy systems, which can be limiting to their ability to change how systems operated. And sometimes, as a customer, you can kind of be exposed to the inner workings of an organization and some of the gaps that information falls into, just like with my contact center example. So service design is not just about ensuring a customer doesn't have to kind of understand what's going on behind the scenes in your organization, but also to help these silos to work more holistically as well. So customers' expectations are getting higher and higher. I'm sure this is not news to anybody either, but people are way more informed about both their rights and also what a great service experience looks like. And a great service that somebody experiences in a completely different context will still become a benchmark that they judge your service offering against, fairly or unfairly. It's just kind of the basis of comparison that's going to get made. And these expectations are changing really quickly. So a nice example is just thinking about stepping into an Uber and the person asking them, and you know, the driver asking you to give them directions. It's just kind of unheard of that you'd have to go to that effort now. So service design is also about helping you to understand your customers' expectations and helping you also to understand the best way to rise to meet them. So as Kasha's already touched on, as service designers, we have to be hyper conscious of the systems that we are that we're influencing when we create anything and we put anything into the world. And the systems that businesses exist within are getting increasingly complex. And I think as the pandemic has shown us, quite fragile in some cases as well. You know, suddenly we've seen everything from production chains breaking to societal structures like casual employment being stretched and even broken in some cases. So one of the functions of service design is also to help you to build a fuller picture of understanding of your place within these systems. And also working out what needs to be true to ensure that you're creating a resilient system around the value that you're trying to deliver to your customers. And finally, this is like a classic point that gets made in every Innovation 101, but everything in the world is moving so bloody quickly and it's incredibly hard to keep up. And yeah, we all know this, but it's an important point to make still, especially now. And it's so hard to predict what might happen and to be proactive as opposed to reactive. And many organizations, especially the organizations who are, you know, legacy organizations, can really find themselves on the back foot and difficult to move quickly. So service design gives you the chance to be on the front foot by being kind of more in tune with the needs of your customers and the teams that support them, as well as the systems that they operate within, and kind of the ability to work together with agility as well.
So these examples of the different challenges that exist out there in the world are partially the reason why service designers exist. And so you might be wondering, well, is there a perfect recipe then for creating a good service? And the answer is no, sorry, but it really does depend on your organization and the context. But there are some principles that you can think of and keep in mind when designing services. And the ones that we're going to walk you through are principles that have been consistently important in our experience and our practice, but by no means they're a complete list or, like I mentioned, a recipe for creating a perfect service. So number one, make your purpose clear. So making your purpose clear really helps helps customers understand what problems you can help them solve. And this really helps set expectations from the start for the experience. I like to think of this as especially important for services that ask people to do things they otherwise wouldn't do. And the first thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about an example for this is the process of applying for permanent residency in Australia. And so there are quite a lot of steps required in this process in the application. And one of them is a medical check. And so for a process like this, it's really important for this service to explain why you are literally asked to get x-rayed to complete a process, right? So it's especially expectations are important in every context, but especially if the customer needs to do something they otherwise wouldn't do. Adapt to natural behavior. So it's good to avoid forcing new behavior on people. And this is why doing research to understand how people behave today is so important in service design, which we'll touch on later, because it helps us adapt to those natural behaviors. And a really good example of that is something that's called desire paths in urban design. So sometimes in urban design projects, the team might observe how natural footpaths form on grass before actually putting it in the concrete pathway. So this is just a bit of an example of how we can first observe behavior to then actually adapt to it and design for it. Don't give clients a peek under your hood. This is probably like the third time we're reinforcing this point, but it's that point about silos again that Harriet mentioned. They are real and they are difficult to remove, but it shouldn't be the customer's problem to solve. With that contact center example that Harriet mentioned, we shouldn't ask the customer to find their way through the different departments in our organizations. Be consistent. So this is about setting guidelines so that, first of all, the same customer will be treated in a similar, consistent way, but also so that different customers are treated similarly, because people talk behind our backs, people read reviews, and these are the kinds of, this sets expectations in a way that's a little bit out of our control, but if we're treating people in a consistent way, that shouldn't be a problem. Empower both clients and service providers. So this is an interesting one because the first one is about empowering people so that they can easily reach for help in the right place if needed. And the second one is about empowering your staff to make the best decisions as long as they align to the consistency guidelines, right? The point from before, be consistent. It's a bit of a fine balance there, consistency and empowerment. And an example that pops to mind here is, for example, if a waiter feeling empowered to offer free drinks to customers, to apologize for a long waiting time, can create a better experience both for the client, for the customer of a bar or a restaurant, but actually for the waiters themselves, because they feel empowered to hopefully make a slightly awkward situation into a better one. But it is an interesting balance there with the consistency and the empowerment. And finally, the last one I want to talk to is about considering the bad and the ugly. So it's important to not only consider the key aspects of an experience, but also considering how do people make a complaint? How do people exit your service? Because these can actually still be moments of delight, and they can leave a good taste for a customer after they've completed an experience. And this is not necessarily like a really bad thing, but this made me think of ASOS and the returns process that they have. It's really, really good. It's super easy. They kind of set you up for success there. If you're not happy with your item, it's very easy to return it.
It also reminds me of Audible. Every time I try and ditch my Audible subscription, they're like, oh, but we'll offer you the next 3 months half price. And I'm a sucker for it every time. Yeah, it's a great example.
Cassie, I just had a quick question or something, I guess, that I was wondering what your thoughts are on around the consistency.
Mm.
One thing that I'll sort of mention sometimes when I'm talking about service design or service experiences, customer journeys to people is something people wouldn't often think of is if the first interaction that a customer has with the organization is really high touch, and there's like a physical person that's walking you through every aspect of that touch point, that interaction, and then you get to the next one and it's really like hands off and there's not much to it, you've almost maybe shot yourself in the foot by over delivering at the beginning, because you're setting an expectation there that isn't then carried through the entire journey. Is that something you find, or the other way around, where you put the high touch piece too late and people don't even get to it? Or
I think it's a really interesting point, because I guess you can look at consistency in different ways. It's not just at looking at oh, this kind of problem is always resolved in a similar way, or this kind of step in the process always looks the same for different people. It's interesting you mentioned that kind of consistency of quality. But I think this is going back to that purpose and making it really clear from the beginning what you'll be able to achieve throughout that experience. But no specific examples pop up to mind for me. Is there anything like a past example that pops up for you, Harriet?
Not off the top of my head, but I just think it's important to differentiate consistency of channel and service style, if you like, because I think the most important thing is having consistent messaging, tonality, and then actually meeting the customer where they need to be met, and it being high touch when it's a moment that they need high touch, and actually sometimes allowing them to be kind of more self-driven in moments when that's also what they need. And I'm not sure it's consistency necessarily means channel always. Yeah,
no, I definitely agree with that. I mean, sometimes if someone just needs to get a form filled out, they don't need an hour-long conversation with a staff member. They just want to do it in the simplest, easiest way possible. I was just kind of wondering, it was something that I just imagined, if someone received really like sort of in-depth service at the beginning and then that expectation is set. Mitigate that, or and then if you don't need it, suddenly you've disappointed someone only because the bar was set so high at the beginning, I guess.
Yeah, that's totally it. And again, if you're setting the bar high at the beginning, then you should obviously be carrying that through. And I guess it just that high bar could be maintained in a few different ways, I guess. And that's the sort of thing to unpick with your customers, is where their expectations sit. But absolutely, great first impression. You don't want to come down from that.
Cool, thank you.
As I mentioned, like, this is nowhere near an exhaustive list of principles or the challenges that we might be facing. So there are some like excellent resources out there that we actually took some inspiration from as well for this bit of our chat. We first, one of them is This is Service Design Doing, and another one is a recent book by Lou Down called Good Services. We'll be sending a follow-up email, as in the Academic Sci team will be tomorrow. So we'll point you to some of those things in there as well. But what we want to do right now is actually get into the practical bit. So how do you do service design?
Yeah, exactly. So we've talked about what it is and why it's important, and theoretically, what does a great service look like and what are the principles that sit behind it. But we wanted to talk you through some of our process. So what does being a service designer actually look and feel like? Next slide. Great, thank you. So probably the most recognizable framework is the Design Council's Double Diamond. I imagine most people have come into contact with this at some point in their research around service design. But essentially what this describes is a really simple looking and elegant design process where it's all about focusing on the problem space, defining the problem to be solved, and then exploring the solution before going into delivery mode. There's 4 phases: discover, define, develop, and deliver. And it's just kind of a neat and tidy little package, which is kind of the backbone of most service design projects, or can be used that way. Next slide. So the most kind of interesting and important thing that I think we can take away from the Double Diamond is this sort of process of going through divergent and convergent phases. So this is a really key concept to keep you on track with any kind of service design work. And they kind of have mindsets that they're required as well for you to embody as a practitioner. So when you're in a sort of diverging phase, it's really important to be open to possibilities and casting the net very wide. Whereas when you're converging, this is about making sense of your findings and being open to re-articulating and reframing your purpose, your challenge, or even your solution all the way through. It's about being flexible. So the beauty of the double diamond and the converge-diverge process is how simple and flexible it is. You can apply this this process to any sort of level of design challenge and at any starting point, just as Kasia was pointing out with one of your first definitions, Kasia. And essentially what it allows you to do is gather the right amount of data and evidence to allow you to make really confident decisions and move forward. So this looks very neat and tidy, doesn't it? So let's move on to the adaptation. All right. So 15 years later, the Design Council has in fact updated the double diamond to be a bit more of an accurate and holistic reflection of the complexity of doing this work and the scope of a service designer's role. So it's a little bit less tidy now, as you can see. But we love this revision for its inclusion of engagement and leadership in particular. Because often this is the most important part of the work that we do, taking the organisation on the journey and just kind of helping to introduce the cultural change that comes along with bringing something like service design into your sort of core operations. So we're going to be using this version of the diamond as a bit of a framework to talk about what service designers do. So we'll just start with the first diamond. Okay. So as we head into the problem space, this phase is really ensuring that we understand the problem that we're actually trying to solve. Oftentimes, we might think that our challenge lies in one area, but then when we look more closely at why something's happening, we can uncover a deeper insight around what it is that we can actually solve for more effectively. So this part of the process, we start out by diverging, and the point here is to try and gather as much information as possible, understanding that we don't yet know what we don't know, if you like. Okay, so starting out with immersion and hypothesis generation. So what this is essentially about understanding the existing system and immersing yourself in the current context. So what is known already by your organization? What are the accepted truths and wisdom that everyone kind of believes to be true about your customers or about the way that teams work? And also, what's the experience and wisdom that you can get from teams that are at the front line who are working with customers day in, day out, but potentially their insight doesn't necessarily always trickle to the top? Because what we find working with every one of our clients is that there is so much knowledge inside an organization, but often lots of different people have different pieces of the puzzle and not really a complete view of one subject area. So it's really helpful just to be able to bring everybody onto the same page and look at the big picture together as a starting point. So from this existing knowledge, we tend to form hypotheses about what it is that's taking place, even what we sort of believe people's motivations and core behaviors are, because what this does is it helps us to give shape to our research and test these assumptions, as well as kind of bringing everyone together and indicating that this is a collaborative process from the get-go. Okay, so when heading into research, there are a heap of different ways that you can design your research, and there's a whole range of different ways of building and understanding. The main point during your research is to gain a deep insight into your participant group, not just what they say, but how they see the world, how they behave when they don't think anyone's looking, and what they're truly motivated by. And this applies not only to our customers, but also to the people inside our organizations and any partner services that you're collaborating with. Again, just to reiterate, it's about creating as holistic a view of the system as you possibly can. So as you can see on the screen here, and we can probably share this slide afterwards because I'm sure people are scribbling notes, but there's a whole range of different ways that you can conduct research. And essentially what it usually means is a trade-off around depth of insight that you're going to glean and the effort and resources involved to undertake that particular type of research. What we usually recommend is trying to be as pragmatic as you can be about this and always trying to blend your different research approaches so that you get kind of a lot of different views or a lot of different levels of insight from different methods. So, for example, you know, we find that using a combination of one-to-one interviews, observational field work, and discovery workshops for a typical project tends to give us a really decent coverage, which is deep enough to help us tackle most challenges. You wouldn't really want to, you know, just conduct guerrilla research on its own and call that a research phase, because you're going to get quite shallow insight from that, even though it can be helpful. And vice versa, it's not very common that you've actually got that much time and resource to be able to conduct a really thorough ethnographic or longitudinal research study. So again, it's just about figuring out what you can do versus what it is you need to learn. So here we are doing some observational fieldwork, which is probably our favorite type when we were allowed to do it, of course. So this is us with a customer who's running a small business, and just being in her space with her, you know, we're probably finding out about the tools she uses, the conversations she has with her customers, you know, her finding out about her relationship with the council, and also how she, you know, connects with the other small businesses that are around her in her community. This project is kind of an interesting example because it was a piece of work about how we might notify businesses about upcoming building disruptions. So what we found out from this business owner was that she really took it upon herself to notify other people about the upcoming disruptions, and kind of felt that she was a bit of a mouthpiece for the local council. And obviously that's a huge amount of work for her, but it did make her feel really valued in the community, and kind of gave her a bit of a sense of purpose. So, you know, that's a really interesting insight about this person. We can ask ourselves the question, how many other people feel that way? Is she kind of an outlier, or are there more people that feel like this? And if so, how could that insight help us to inform potential solutions? So we're kind of really making an effort to better understand, again, not just the practical things around her and the things she's saying, but her needs, her mindsets, and the environment. This is also a really great opportunity to bring people along to kind of really immerse in your customer environments as well. Okay. And then when we hit the saturation point, essentially, we've got so much data. You know when you've got so much data because you're starting to just hear the same things again and again. At this point, you're probably drowning in Post-it notes, or virtual Post-it notes, it would be now. But the point of synthesis and analysis is about making links between information that might not have been apparent before. So kind of getting a true understanding of what's needed, or what's actually happening at the root of your challenge. So a great example was that we were doing a piece of work for a careers service, and the challenge, you know, we were sort of posed with, what can we do to uplift this service? But it turned out, when we did a bunch of research, was that there was not any problem with the service itself, really. It was the fact that students weren't thinking about their careers soon enough, and were leaving their engagement to the point where they were practically at graduation, and they were in such an emotionally heightened state that it made it really difficult for them to make decisions. So our challenge space kind of changed at that point, from being about how do we make sure this service is functioning as well as it can, to how do we actually encourage students to think about their careers earlier and to engage with the service easier. Anyway, this is a step that's often rushed, but it is the most important one. Kasia.
So after immersing ourselves in this problem space and really understanding the people in that space, this is where the two diamonds meet, and we can enter the solution space. And at this point in the middle, where the two diamonds meet, is where we should have a clear evidence-based definition of a specific problem to solve. And the way that we usually start this phase is by diverging again. So Harriet mentioned diverging and converging at the beginning of this chat. This is what we call ideation, or what it should just be called idea generation, where we get lots of people in the room to come up with many different ways to solve this problem. And there's likely to be a really huge variety of ways to solve it. And we like to bring different people in the organization into this process as well, because different people have different talents, different people have different understanding of the world, different ways of looking at it. So it's really brilliant to bring different thinkers together, because we're going for quantity, not as much as quality at this stage. We want to really open it up and think about all these different ways we could approach this problem. So in a sense, you could think of this as another round of hypothesis testing. So Harriet mentioned that we start the problem space kind of diamond with a hypothesis generation. In here, we're creating tangible hypotheses as like lots of different solutions that to a specific problem that we can go out and test. But you might be asking yourselves, and a lot of students when I teach this ask me, like, how the hell do you test something intangible like a service? So on a simpler level, tangible products, especially digital ones, still form part of a service experience. So we can test those. So as you can see in the left upper corner and the right lower corner, we do prototype digital experiences and test those with people. But in terms of the intangible elements of a service, how do you test those? Well, what we try to do is to make them into a tangible artifact that people can respond to. So what you can do is you can create a storyboard of an experience. So in the left lower corner, you can see someone walking through I think this is a student experience as well. Just translating things into a series of drawings with a bit of a narrative makes it so much easier for people to engage with your idea and to understand what you're trying to do and to give you some sort of feedback. It introduces another way of explaining your idea, as opposed to just trying to explain it verbally. Another thing that you can do is service enactments, where you actually get to enact a service. This is where you get to use your acting skills. And actually in that project that Harriet mentioned that we did with a career service, we enacted some different scenarios of how the service could be in front of students for feedback. So it's thinking about how can I actually make this experience into something tangible to put in front of people and get their feedback that way. But it's important to mention that we need to consider the level of fidelity of the different prototypes that we're using. And this depends on the stage of developing the solution. So at the start, when we have loads of these different ideas that I mentioned, we want to be quick. We don't want to spend a lot of time and a lot of money on testing solutions that could simply be wrong. But as we continue to learn and test and we understand what works and doesn't work, we can introduce more detail to the solution and we can continue increasing the fidelity all the way until we're ready to trial it with a small group of customers. And so what happens at the very end with that little arrow? It's a tiny arrow on the diamond, but it's actually a really important one, because this is where we get to prioritize and plan out next steps with an organization. So once we understand what is likely to be most effective for customers, it's really important to introduce a lens of feasibility and viability. We do like to start just looking at desirability to allow for that blue sky thinking, but it's important to have check-ins throughout the process with the right experts in an organization to make sure that we're designing a solution that can actually take place. So in a sense, you can think of service designers as facilitators of the trade-offs between those three lenses. We're there to represent the voice of the customer and facilitate the conversation with the organization, learn what's possible, bring that back to the customer, learn whether that's okay, bring back the learnings, and so on. So think about it as an iterative conversation that we're there to facilitate.
Okay, awesome. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm gonna head through this relatively rapidly, even though I think this is in some ways the most essential part. So we've just been through the straightforward, simplest version of a double diamond. But one of the reasons, like I said before, that we love the updated double diamond model is that it reflects that a service design project only exists within an environment in which successful engagement and leadership are also happening. So opportunities to engage the organisation are crucial throughout your piece of work, because without the right people in the room to inform the work and to be informed by the work, it's very unlikely to land properly after an outcome has been reached, and also to take into account all of the relevant information and context that's required. On the other hand as well, because service design often represents a departure from BAU, especially when your organization's first getting to grips with it, and it often needs to move at pace. There is something of a balance of sheltering the project to continue at speed whilst effectively involving all the right people. So what we really like about the service design process and some of the rituals that we've already talked about is that it gives us the structure and the moments to productively engage stakeholders so they actually really authentically get to contribute to the process. Another really important point to make is around the importance of interdisciplinary and diverse teams. So this is just an example of one project structure, and it can scale up and scale down depending on what it is you're working on, but it's really reflective of the sort of diversity of mindsets and skills required. That is, again, around desirability, feasibility, and viability, which I'm sure is a framework you're all familiar with. So at Make, we really love working in blended teams because our aim is always to ensure that the team feels like they've got ownership of the work, but also because we know that we can just move so much faster and further with the right context in place. So governance is also a really critical part of this, you know, the ability to keep a broader strategic view, ensure that the project has relevance and alignment with those sort of strategic priorities, plus for any leadership to be able to speak to the work beyond the project space as well. So it's fair to say that storytelling and communication is probably the most important thing that we do as designers. Throughout any project, in addition to engagement sessions, we also overlay opportunities for people to come together and see the work as it's developing. So this facilitates empathy for the customers and the other research participants, but it also tends to create empathic leaps for people from different teams who perhaps don't come into contact very often. Again, about seeing that whole picture of the system in one place, it can be really, really helpful, just for kind of pushing the values of collaboration and transparency as well. So, you know, when we worked IRL, we'd always have a project space that people could just drop in and out of. We'd host open studios throughout, weekly open studios throughout the work, as well as hosting showcases. And sometimes, different types of stories and storytelling devices resonate in different places. We recently just handed over a podcast that was recorded with heaps of different parts of an organization talking about the work. So it really depends on what works best for your environment. And of course, we've had to adjust the way that we work since the pandemic. I mean, it's pretty obvious that, a lot of the images that we've shown you have been, have had lots of humans in them. And so how does service design translate to this online space? So in many ways, we're quite lucky at Make because we've always had access to a company in Hong Kong. So we're quite used to working online in many ways. And service design does translate very well to the virtual space in most ways. But it is a very human and very visual discipline. So we have to be a bit clever about the way that we approach these projects now, with things like virtual project rooms. Miro is a tool that we've been using heaps, and I'm sure we're not the only ones who are here who've been using it. But it's more essential than ever. But you can in many ways replicate that sense of a project room for collaboration, having everybody around looking at the same things and the same data in one place. So we found that really helpful. And then more broadly, from a leadership perspective and a cultural change perspective, it's really important that there is sort of there's a leadership element of a sponsor who can advocate for this way of working and just hold space for service design, especially when it's very new. For many places, it's a very different way of working, and explaining sort of the value that it can bring is a really crucial part of that puzzle, as well as helping other people to understand what the tools and methodologies are. How can I become involved in this kind of way of working is a really, really helpful way to bring everyone on the journey as well. And finally, from me, so you might be asking yourself, what's the output of this process? Of course, apart from the insight and the service and design outcomes themselves, what we'll do is generally produce tools that help us to translate findings so they can be applied back to the organization and scale. So tools for allowing insight to be shared, for example, things like personas that create an empathic connection and allow customers to be more meaningfully received at different points, or the journeys which kind of bring to life the end-to-end journey that people might go through with your service. And then equally, you know, when it comes to rolling out a design solution, things like blueprints, which you can see on the left here, which talks to organizational capability, as well as the customer experience, road mapping, that sort of thing. The outcomes for every project can and should always be varied and always be bespoke to the piece of work that you're doing, because everything that we discover throughout the project will shape how that outcome needs to be and who it needs to be received by. The things to remember about this is that these tools are not a means to an end. They are tools to facilitate more meaningful and scaled outcomes.
Awesome. So I just have 3 takeaway points for you before we jump into Q&A. So the first question that might be on your mind is, okay, great. Do I have to do all this? And as we mentioned, there is no perfect recipe. So it's about asking yourself, what does your organization really need? Or what do your customers really need? Because you can start small and start somewhere. It's not about doing all of these things at once. The second question you might be asking yourself if you're thinking about transitioning to service design is, well, do I have what it takes to become a service designer? And we like to think about that it's all about mindsets. Be curious and learn as much as you can. Empathize with everyone as much as you can in a service and in the system. Practice the divergent and convergent thinking. And finally, be collaborative. The whole last bit that Harriet talked about, engagement is the key to success. No matter how amazing your research is or how brilliant your solution is, if the organization is not aligned on a common purpose, the efforts might actually get lost. So here we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys, that's awesome. Tons of super interesting information in there, whether you're new to the world of service design completely, or whether you are sort of a practitioner in the design space that just wants to know a little bit more about service design and what it looks like on the inside. So thank you very much. That's great. Yay, one man clap. Now I'll go through, we've got about 10 minutes. So we'll go through as many questions as we can. They're starting to stack up now, so we might not get through all of them, but we'll do our best. I might have to just sort of pick and choose some. So from Gaurav, such a great presentation, agree. I'm a graphic designer and interaction designer, so UI. How might I transition into service design? What would some of your favorite books be? You mentioned the 2 of them there. Any other resources, like open source resources that you might recommend?
Actually, the book that I mentioned before, Good Services by Lou Down, she has a whole website for that, which comes with like an evaluation tool for evaluating your services, which is a really good one. So we can link people to that.
Great, yep, will do. Here's a good one that got liked by someone. So I've never noticed that this kind of jumps things up the board for me here. You learn something new every day. Would there be, I think, so I saw when this came through, when you're going through the double diamond process, do you circle back around? I know the answer to this, but I think it'll be good for everyone to hear. Not blowing my own horn there, but yeah, is it always just a linear process, or does it circle about sometimes?
I mean, it's absolutely an iterative process. You know, I can't count the amount of times, especially when you suddenly get to the end of your discovery phase and you realize that your problem space has been actually sitting somewhere completely else. It is very much a process which it should be flexible and should be reactive and I suppose allow you to respond to those things that come up as you're going through it. Saying that, of course, most of us probably are used to working in kind of project timeframes that kind of pragmatically have to end at a certain point. So it is important to kind of consider the best use of time and be able to argue for, well, it's important that we do another week of research, or it's important that we do another week of prototyping to really feel confident to move ahead. So we always tend to talk about it as how confident are we to make a call that this is the right solution or this is the right outcome for the piece of work. Ultimately, we're always working towards arguing for the best outcome at the end of the project. And sometimes that means reframing and reshaping the thing that you deliver. And that will happen naturally through a process of looping back round and revisiting points and asking more questions when you feel like you've got a gap in your knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'll often talk in these sessions about, a good designer views constraints as a challenge to be overcome, and that they expect that to happen. But you have to sort of balance your constraints against the need to get things right as well. So if you are going to go back and redo something, you just have to be able to make a really strong case to the organization of why you have to do this thing, or it's worth doing it. And is that a battle, like that particular battle? Is that one you want to fight or not? And yeah, there's a lot of these trade-offs that come into the decision-making process as you move through. Great question. Harriet and Cassia, what are the key distinctions you see between service design and UX product design? Good one.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question because I think it pops up a lot, and different practitioners look at these definitions differently. But UX design really looks, it focuses more on the interface, the frontline interface and the immediate experience for the customers, which is often digital, whereas in service design, we'll be looking deeply at the back end and how a certain experience is delivered. And so that's how I look at it. And I don't know if you have a different way of defining it. The thing is that UX designers and service designers often work close together. So the edges get blurry at times, which is why it's very, very difficult. It's a great question because it's difficult to put us in those really specific boxes and say that that's the only way. But if I had to pull out a key difference, that would be the one.
Yeah.
That's as people who teach this stuff, the way we usually put it is, say you had a customer journey map, so you've got all these touch points arrayed along a line, and that's the journey a customer takes with you from beginning to end. Some of those touch points within that line are going to be digital, and that's where the UXer is going to focus their time, but they're still sitting within the remit of the service designer, who is responsible for that whole service design line or that whole customer journey line, and then the back end processes that sit beneath it. So we'll sometimes, in like slide decks, when we're teaching it, we'll show it as here's the service design square, and then there'll be smaller squares inside, and that's the UXer space.
I like to just think about it as zooming out kind of a thing. Yeah.
We've done it a few different ways. You can show it along the customer journey map line, or in a box, and then it's inside. It just sort of shows that it tends to be the UXer focuses on the digital touch points that sit within the larger service design space, I guess. And then the way we usually show it, CX even sits almost outside of the service design one. It's an imperfect sort of example, but it gives you an idea of where the spaces sit in relation to each other. Great question. From Avin, normally what would be, and actually you did touch on this briefly, but what would be the outputs that Make would provide to clients, like the actual physical handover maybe? Like, is it a recommendations report? Is it artifacts? What do you usually give?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above, really. And like I said before, it really depends on what we feel through the process of the work is going to be most valuable. Usually we will start out with, a service design process which results in a new service blueprint for a new service going live. And so what normally happens is we'll produce the artifact, which might be, depending on whether we're going all the way through to design or stopping at research, it will be something that describes, a customer experience, be that ideal state or current state, in some kind of format which has been designed usually with the teams who are going to be interacting with it. So kind of doing a little bit of a meta design process to understand if you're supposed to be using the insight from or the directives from this project? How do you need that to be? Does it need to live on the wall? You know, how long does it need to last? All of those kind of questions are the types of things that we'll ask ourselves to shape things up. And then, of course, there's always an insight report, which is coupled with a showcase, usually an interactive showcase, where we'll be inviting people, not for the first time. Again, like I was saying, there's always multiple opportunities for stakeholder groups to get involved all the way through the process, because the last thing anybody needs is getting to the showcase and then you know, any unpleasant surprises, you know, for either the stakeholders or the design team not having the right, having had the right information in the past. So yeah, it's much about the storytelling materials that we produce as it is about the work, essentially, because you can do the best work in the world, but if nobody knows about it, then you haven't really got anything. Yeah.
Yeah, we're very similar. When I work with clients to build out like training programs, I usually, one of the first questions I ask is like, what do you need to make this a success for you? Like, what's a win for you look like, and how can we deliver something that's going to help you, you know, like get traction with this internally? And if there are specific outputs, they're like, what I really need you to do is just give me this thing, and that's the thing that's going to gain traction at exec level, for example. And that sort of, and then you give them what you know, because they know the internal aspects of their organization, so they'll be able to tell you what's going to gain cut through in terms of documentation, et cetera, and what won't. Another good question. We're running pretty short on time. Maybe I'll just pick this last one that's been upvoted the most. And actually, this was a question that I wrote down when it didn't look like we were going to get any questions, and I was going to fill in the gaps. Is, say you are, I'm going to sort of use my own words a little bit, but it's definitely the question being asked, is what happens when, and you'll have to be quite quick with this one, what happens when you're having trouble getting cut through? Like there's like a stakeholder that, like maybe an exec level person that isn't interested in what you have to do. How can you communicate what you, like the value of what you're doing to them?
I think that this often comes with helping them understand the role that we can play in this process. And this is where, you know, the fact that we're using human-centered design comes into play, because we, the recommendations that we're making or the insights that we're sharing are all evidence-based. They're based on what we've learned about the customers or the organization. So it's not our opinions. It's our consolidated view of all of our learnings. And if that is still difficult for a person to connect with, this is where we can practice things like taking the person along with us to some of the research sessions so that they get that first-hand experience. But saying that, you know, it sounds simple, but sometimes the problem is much deeper. Harriet.
So I think I might just have to cut you guys off. My bad. We're pretty much at time. We don't actually get chopped out of the Zoom recording like sometimes happens, but we're aware that people want to get back to their, well, maybe not want to, but have to get back to their working life.
Yeah.
Because we're so exciting to talk to. Did you guys just want to talk about, I think you had a little offer for everyone on the call today?
Yes, so we have an upcoming workshop for called the Collaboration in the Age of Reinvention that we're doing in collaboration with one of the writers actually of service design doing, Adam Lawrence, and founder of Workplace Experience. So we have a discount code for all of you, a 50% off for this workshop with the code community, but we will be sending you all of the details for that in the follow-up email tomorrow.
Great, thank you. So yeah, so that'll be just about the end of the webinar. So a few pieces. Yeah, we'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow. We'll try and answer some of the questions that were still remaining in the QA. We'll also have that offer from Make. From Academy XI's perspective, we've got obviously a range of courses, either deep dives on service design if you want to upskill into a new role, or we have one-day introduction to human-centered design courses for teams, all that sort of thing. So if you are interested in that for your team or yourself, just let us know. We can have a chat. Also, we've got a number of upcoming webinars, which I think are pretty cool. I'm obviously slightly biased on that, but we've got one on the use of video in the innovation and design process with a gentleman who creates these sort of cut-through videos for stakeholder management purposes for MasterCard, which is pretty neat, in innovation sprints. And then we've got a digital capability uplift webinar, how to bring baseline capability in digital into your organization if that's a challenge you're facing. And then we're doing something similar a few weeks after that, but for data. So bringing data capability into your organization as well. So keep an eye out for those. Keep an eye out for the email. Tomorrow, just following up some of the topics we've talked about today, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to both of you guys. That was really, really interesting. If you have any questions for Make, obviously you can reach out through the email that's sent tomorrow. Otherwise, thanks for your time. We'll be obviously, continuing to run these webinars. Really appreciate your attendance and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.